So, some people love the show, some people hate it. I personally fall into the former category. I genuinely think South Park is very intelligent, yes, intelligent political satire, and a great parody of how utterly stupid any idea can be when taken to its furthest possible extreme. And I get that some people would criticise the show for being on the fence politically, but that's kind of the point of the entire thing. So with that small disclaimer out of the way, let's start with typing the four boys of South Park. So first let's start with the true underdog of the show, Kenny. Originally in South Park, Kenny's purpose was just to die, and I guess in some instances his primary purpose as a form of slapstick humour was also there to represent people's general desensitization to the suffering that goes on below a certain income threshold. However, as the seasons progress, Kenny tends to get a bit more character. In some instances he even takes his hood off and actually forms words. Furthermore, whereby Coon and friends, the superhero alter egos of the other boys, are there as just a child play. Kenny is the one who actually fully embraces his alter ego identity. He actually acts out his superhero personality. And through the character of Mysterion, you actually get a lot of insights into Kenny's raw potential, his ability to transform himself, his unique character trait whereby as long as he believes in his abilities, he can accomplish anything he sets out to do. But all of his capabilities rest upon his own self-transformative state, rest on his ability to become a symbol, a metaphor. And it is through this transformation into a symbol that Kenny effectively transforms his previous self. And what is his previous self? The previous self is somebody who is easily led, a person with somewhat hedonistic tendencies, someone who can get carried away in the moment, while also having a strong desire to be accepted by his chosen subculture, and generally so sensitive that he lacks a certain ability to stand up for himself. Kenny effectively represents the two extremes of an ISFP. On the one hand, you have someone who can get a bit carried away in a moment with extroverted sensing authority, and in this instance, their introverted feeling, introverted intuitive dominant functions are there first of all just to justify and form an identity upon their own unfortunate circumstances or potentially destructive impulses, and secondly, prioritizing one's fitting into any given subculture over the preservation of one's own health and longevity. However, it is both through his creation of the alter ego of Mysterion and his gradual character development throughout the seasons that Kenny is shown to be, through all of the other characters of his age, one of the most mature, driven, objective and authentic characters out of them all. So I actually really like Kenny's character. I really like the journey that he goes through throughout the entire seasons. And yeah, every now and again they do return Kenny to his former self, and it is kind of in keeping with the fluctuative identity of the ISFP. But I like how the show explores his strengths. I like how the show explores his self-transformative ability, and the ability for an 80-year-old in this instance to become someone who even mature adult law enforcement officers can't, and his ability through Mysterion to essentially quadruple his mental age. And now I want to take Kyle. I mean, in many ways his character screams ENFP, doesn't he? He totally conforms to that kind of champion stereotype, the person who embodies that kind of moral agenda. The person who's consistently driven by a sense of altruism and authenticity, while at the end of every single arc, feels a need to summarize and encapsulate everything that's gone on and what people have learnt in a single monologue. But I don't actually think he is an ENFP. First of all, let's explore his primary lens. Just like all of the other four boys, he gets very caught up in the moment. He's very experiential in nature, but that nature isn't always connected to a contingency. Sometimes that nature, I'd say most of the time, that nature is occupying the here and now. And yeah, he's a very altruistic individual, but I don't think that altruism is actually stemming from an introverted feeling of authority. First of all, he's very self-conscious about what people think of him, and it's relatively rare in a show for him to go against the status quo for the sake of his own ideals. Yes, it does sometimes happen. Yes, he sometimes does seem a little bit more introverted feeling authority-like, but I believe his authority function, that primary driving force, is actually introverted thinking, connected to an introverted intuitive lens. I believe Kyle seeks to uphold the status quo of what is acceptable and what will secure continued extroverted feeling harmony, more than he does embody values as an extension of his individualistic self. I don't see Kyle as an individualist. I don't see him having that intense introvert feeling authority of the ENFP. I absolutely believe Kyle's invested in his own experience. I definitely think he's a lens dominant. But first of all, I don't think he has that intense need to be the fullest version of himself around every single person. And secondly, as strong as his introverted feeling is, I don't believe he's that consciously aware of it. I definitely think his introverted feeling is connected to a very concrete introverted sensing lens. But I think these two functions occupy a more unconscious state. As strong as the character's values are, they don't always seem to be things that he is consciously aware of. I think oftentimes he seems to be quite confused by how something has caused him to act in a certain way, and uncertain whether any altruistic agenda he's currently pursuing is good for himself or even other people on an emotional level. I think he's much more concerned with the maintenance of the relative status quo. I believe the core reason for his relatively altruistic agenda a lot of the time is because of his relatively strict upbringing, who has been raised in such a way as to embody an introverted, intuitive, introverted thinking moral framework, while also not entirely consciously aware of where his logic ends and his feelings begin. You'll often notice that Kyle is the one who has a kind of societal danger point. It is him, and indeed Wendy, who I believe to be an ENFJ, who would both have that kind of introverted intuition, introverted thinking, divergent functions. However, the trigger point for Kyle revolves more around introverted thinking than it does an introverted intuitive vision. And his introverted intuitive vision can oftentimes be suppressed when he gets caught up in the heat of a moment. And that's why he oftentimes seems to rotate between a character who's highly sensitive to the societal implications of any given action, sometimes even switching into INFJ mode, so to speak, when he rotates on his dominant axis in order to give a compelling speech or steer a certain character's development. But just as much of the time, if not even more so, he's actually quite mischievous. He's actually getting caught up in the heat of the moment with his friends. And as antagonistic his relationship is with the anti-hero of Cartmen, it's also clear that he revels in the chaos. It's also clear that he enjoys occasionally suppressing his introverted intuition to get caught up in the heat of the moment. And as such, Kyle is actually an excellent representation of an ESTP who has an incredibly fluid dominant axis and a highly altruistic agenda, but is also in a kind of struggle with his opposing function, a struggle with himself. He hasn't yet found a way to harmonize his dominant stack with his opposing stack. And now let's explore the personality type of Kyle's best friend, Stan. Stan is in many ways a lot more emotionally private than Kyle. And whereas Kyle's primary dialogue seems to be more limbic in nature, the primary dialogue of Stan seems to be a lot more cerebral, a lot more detached. And generally Stan is the one who can be relied upon to form a kind of very detached, objective surveillance of the current situation and what its implications are. And while he doesn't have as deep a moral agenda necessarily as Kyle does, he seems to have an equally concrete lens attached to his introverted feeling. He seems to be quite naturally secure in who he is, while simultaneously doesn't take a lot of active responsibility for his identity. So far we seem to have a convergent thinking with a divergent feeling accompanied by an introverted sensing lens. However, in conscious terms, I believe his thinking is much more introverted, and conversely, I believe his feeling is much more extroverted by nature. He seems to abide by norms, customs, and expectations fairly easily, and indeed feels very insecure when he is unable to attain the standards of normality. That, alongside his quite keen, specific observation of social situation, seems to indicate a divergent extroverted feeling, accompanied with an extroverted sensing lens. And as such, his introverted thinking seems to be accompanied by introverted intuition. So far we have an ISTP. And this seems to make a lot of sense. First of all, ISTPs and ESTPs oftentimes have a natural rapport. But more importantly to the argument, Stan doesn't seem to have a particularly conscious introverted feeling beyond his introverted thinking dip into it. Therefore, he seems to form strong attachments to what he can do and what his frameworks are, while also having an identity which is otherwise formed by a sense of normality, the external world, and by the archetypes of society. And like with all of the other four boys, he has a very potent extrovert sensing lens. He definitely gets caught up in the moment. The thing that unites these characters together is their very intense concrete experience, their ability to get carried away, their ability to completely lose a sense of consequence. And each of the carries this antagonistic relationship with the more long-term, future-oriented version of themselves. But beyond his simple attachment and his concrete experience of reality, and the occasional impulsive behaviour which is driven by an extrovert sensing authority, the thing that stands out to me about Stan the most is his ability to acquire new skills, to assimilate new information and form a very reasonable and rational perspective of what's going on, without necessarily investing in that perspective emotionally. And his ability to quickly form new skills and take it to a point of mastery is shown quite neatly in the Guitar Hero-based episode of South Park. It started out as Kyle and Stan just kind of playing Guitar Hero just to pass the time, having a healthy sense of competition, but then Stan became obsessed with it. And then when he was influenced by all the characters to embark down this obsessive journey to becoming the best Guitar Hero player there was, Stan began to lose himself. He became completely detached from his introverted feeling, detached from his friends and family, and pursued the point of mastery with a single-minded determination. And now I want to take the anti-hero of the show, a lot of people's favourite character. But before we go any further, I need to point out that Cartmen is a sociopath. He's not a psychopath, of course. It's actually been explored in an arc of the show that when Cartmen's home environment changes, he actually becomes completely normal. And in a recent season, he went through an entire transformation of character, whereby he became so genuinely altruistic that all of the other characters couldn't believe it and subsequently convinced themselves, wrongly, that he was up to no good. So Cartman isn't a psychopath, but he definitely does exhibit certain sociopathic tendencies. So Cartman, what an absolute mess of a character. At home he's allowed to run absolutely rampant, he's been instilled with no moral values whatsoever, nor has he been taught about the consequences of his actions. Furthermore, his obese state and the way that people generally react to him has caused him to be in such a delusional state that he's actually incapable of learning from any consequences that he upon himself has incurred. So yeah, he's a very funny character, but he's also quite a tragic one. And in many ways, he's highly symbolic of the destructive tendencies of human nature and how easy it is to nurture a human being who's so much more destructive than they are constructive. But to make matters worse, Cartman is actually highly, highly intelligent, perhaps the most intelligent character in South Park. Generally, once his character sets himself on a path, once he has foreseen a vision he wants to see realised in reality, it is through a combination of guile, charisma and tenacity that he so oftentimes sees his goals realised, no matter how unrealistic they may have seemed at the onset. And that's the thing, Cartman doesn't let anything go. Cartman does not know compromise. His introverted feeling is by far the most divergent out of any of the characters in South Park. His divergence-convergence continuum is completely and utterly polarised. And except on a few occasions, the fluidity between his dominant and opposing function is almost non-existent. And he will only ever dip into extroverted feeling from the extroverted thinking position insofar as is necessary to manipulate other people. So yeah, we have dominant extroverted thinking and oppositional introverted feeling. The oppositional introverted feeling is definitely connected to introverted intuition because Cartman foresees a distant future and then knows absolutely no compromise. The only outcome he is happy with is the exact outcome he himself has foreseen. And he generally stops at nothing to make sure this outcome is realised. Furthermore, his experience of external reality is undoubtedly concrete in nature. I'd say even hyper-concrete. And it is this value, this existence within a raw, tangible, concrete moment that makes Cartman so charismatic and that pushes most of Cartman's desires towards the tangible, the concrete. He doesn't desire for any kind of abstract reality. All of the things he desires in reality are concrete in nature. He wants authority. He wants pleasure in the form of food. He wants people's absolute and unquestioning respect. And of course, more than anything, he wants a safe space. A space in which he is impervious from any kind of criticism. A space where he can live in his own delusional world for as long as he wants. And a space where reality itself forms itself around his own desires and subsequently tiptoes around his own sensitivity. So Cartman is essentially a high magnitude ENTJ. Not because ENTJs are like Cartman, but because his cognitive makeup is that of the ENTJ's cognitive stack. Dominant extroverted thinking connected to the raw, tangible experience of extroverted sensing, fixated on a single outcome, and utterly focused in what it's setting out to achieve, while very much possessing a kind of tunnel vision and a lack of natural attunement to the consequences of one's actions. All the while being driven by this hyper-divergent, introverted, intuitive authority, connected as it is to an oppositional introverted feeling function that Cartman has absolutely no responsibility for. Cartman is in every way, shape and form subservient to his introverted, intuitive, introverted feeling vision. All the while highly imaginative, highly individualistic, long-term future-oriented, and absolutely insanely creative with what he would come up to in order to see his goals realised. And when Cartman eventually enters into a romantic relationship with Heidi, before he reverts back to his baser nature, the show finally displays Cartman putting his natural intelligence and drive to good use. But sadly, as can often be the case with a sociopathic ENTJ coupled with an INFP, Cartman does actually, when he transforms into his older self, start to begin to have a very, very negative impact on his girlfriend Heidi. And he literally turns her into an even worse version of himself. But as usual, owing to his delusional state, he's unable to take responsibility for this situation. And even when confronted with another version of himself, when literally presented a mirror to his darker nature, he cannot see past his delusional image of grandeur. And Cartman definitely does on some level gravitate towards INFP characters. And I believe first of all, he sees these characters as very easy to manipulate. But I believe secondly, and more importantly, perhaps on a very deeply unconscious level, he is drawn towards those characters who have the ability to see the good in him. And this definitely explains his relationship with the INFP character of Butters. Because no matter what happens, Buddha's faith in humanity and his endlessly optimistic perspective means that no matter what Cartmen does time and time again, Buddha gives him the benefit of the doubt. And yeah, on some level, Cartmen likes this just because he can manipulate Buddhas. But I believe on a more deeper and fundamental level, Cartmen enjoys Buddha's company because deep down he wants to believe there is good in himself. And he believes Buddha is the means by which he can tap into his better side and overcome the self-destructive creature he is currently inhabiting. So yeah, as a bonus character, let's now explore Buddhas, who has become over time the fifth child protagonist of the show. And while Buddhas is presented as somewhat of a fool in some instances, very easily led, and generally quite naive in his introverted feeling dialogue, he also has a very strong sense of character. Notice that no matter what happens to Buddhas, he never lets go of that kind of optimism. He never lets go. He never loses faith in humanity. And he's always willing to entertain the possibility, yes, the possibility, of a different set of circumstances, of a character having good intentions. And this to me utterly screams an introverted feeling, introverted sensing adaptation to an extroverted intuitive authority. Buddhas is an extremely imaginative character. And much as with Kenny, when you introduce the superhero alter egos of the boys, Buddhas prefers to do his own thing. Because both Kenny and Buddhas are the true individualists, the people whose primary dialogue is occupied with an introverted feeling dominant function. But just as how Cartman's sociopathy rubbed off on his girlfriend, it also rubbed off on Buddha's, which is demonstrated by his relationship with his sidekick, General Disarray. But it is through his alter ego of Professor Chaos that Buddha's essentially vents his frustration with the world around him, his frustration of being manipulated by people, his frustration that the world around him doesn't live up to his ideals. And it is through his alt of Professor Chaos that Buddha seeks to transform himself from prey to predator. And this is a good example of how the introverted feeling dominant, in this instance the INFP, in those instances whereby they feel they can safely and without repercussions rotate on their dominant axis to occupy an extroverted thinking dominant state. In this state, they can serve their emotions without any kind of altruistic agenda. But time and time again, no matter how far Buddha is pushed, he never loses his strength of character. He always remains true to himself. And it could be argued that his alter Professor Chaos is no more than a means to essentially vent his frustration, a healthy outlet of anger that would be otherwise suppressed. So that was a bit of an experiment. I have absolutely no idea how many of you like this show, but if you enjoyed it, if you found it informative, definitely let me know if you want another one down in the comments. At this point in time, I haven't yet released my third part, possibly the final part of my Lord of the Rings series. I know many of you requested it. I'm definitely going to get around to that at some point soon. So if you know any fellow South Park fans, definitely send this video their way. And if you yourself enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like. It really does help the channel grow, develop, and reach new audiences. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to hit that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it. That way you can stay notified of future content. So just a few more call to actions before I leave you, and if you're still with me so far, thank you, you are awesome. If you're interested in the underlying theory explored in this video, I highly recommend you check out the CPT ebook if you haven't already. And if you yourself are curious about your type, or just want to know how your particular type applies to you as an individual, I highly recommend you check out the CPT type service. And finally, I'm happy to say CPT is now on Patreon, so if you're interested in supporting the channel and theory on that additional level, that would be massively, massively appreciated. But I do have to say I'm already incredibly grateful for your support over here. So once again, I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to share it with anyone who you think might enjoy it too, and I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.